What if people could talk freely about race? What if people could talk naturally, comfortably, and intuitively about race? And what if people could be empathetic with others about race? Race is the biggest challenge in America today. There's nothing more divisive or damaging than conflict around race. And no other aspect of diversity and inclusion creates more challenges for us as we go through our daily lives. Many times you hear people talk about, I'd like to live in a race-free society, or I'd like to live in a colorblind society. I would say no, because I'm proud of my race. We should all be proud of our race. We should be proud of our history, our traditions, and our people. We always encourage everybody to do research around their race and heritage, and what you find you should share with others. Every one of our own racial heritages has something distinct and something valuable. If we could find a way in conflict to forgive the mistakes, to clarify the uncertainties, to educate the unknowing, and to encourage the unwilling, we could do a far better job around how we manage the way we fuss and fight about race. So we're going to do a little bit of an exercise right now. If you've done this exercise before, and I think some of you have, I'm going to ask you not to participate. I'm going to ask you to follow my lead, and here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask you to have a couple responses in unison as a group. First of all, I'm going to ask you to repeat a word 10 times. I'm going to keep the count on my right hand. When we're done, I'm going to ask you a specific question, and then I'm going to prompt you for a response. Everybody clear? Yes. Thank you. The word is white. Ready? White, 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 white. What do cows drink? Gotcha. Cows drink water. Now, that's a pretty basic diversity exercise, but here's what's important about it. I conditioned you in a period of about a minute for a very specific response. And we have to start to think about who's conditioning us outside in our lives. If you watch the news each day, you hear it. We're being conditioned by the news, the media, the movies. Even when we binge watch Netflix, we're being conditioned, because binging is part of that. And why are they conditioning us? Primarily to encourage us to engage in behaviors that serve their values, not our own. You have to think about the things you believe about others with conditioning in mind. What are your attitudes about the homeless, about immigrants, about the LGBT community, about black folk? Where did you get those beliefs, and are they consistent with the beliefs that your family raised you with? In the 50s, we grew up in a predominantly black neighborhood in Northeast DC. We were very proud people. We had a huge black Santa Claus that we placed out in front of the house every Christmas. Every day there was modern jazz playing in the house with names of people we could be so proud of. People like Jimmy Smith, Wes Montgomery, Sonny Rollins, Thelonious Monk, and Dave Brubeck. Dave Brubeck is white, just so you know. But the interesting thing was Dave Brubeck was cool, and his music was even cooler. But what impressed me most was the way my parents revered Dave Brubeck just like they did Jimmy Smith. We had white families in our neighborhood as well. The Grimms and the Friedoffs, they were good people. And we also had this huge friend group, 30, maybe 40 kids, all around the same age, give or take 5 or 6 years. And we all did everything together. We rode our bikes, we fought, we played every sport. We even used to take the old DC Transit trolley cars throughout the city. But what we also realized that we did have differences. But no matter what our differences were, we knew we were neighbors, we were friends, and we were family. Now, you probably remember West Side Story. Perhaps not. Well, West Side Story was a story about gangs. And back in the 60s, that was real. We had gangs in our neighborhood. Lamont Riggs' gang to the north, the dangerous Decatur Street gang to the west, and our gang, the North Michigan Park Crew. And whenever any of these neighborhoods would challenge our white friends, we would fight to defend them because we were family. But interestingly enough, when we got into a fist fight with our white friends, race was always the driving factor behind it. But whenever the fight was done, race was no more an issue. We didn't see people like us on TV or in the newspapers or even on the newsreels. Newsreels were those things they show at the movies. Instead of the previews, they would show big national stories. And I remember when Jackie Robinson, I saw him on a newsreel running the bases, and I'll never forget that moment. And every one of us, including our white friends, thought it was really critical to emulate his style. And we were thinking back then at the tender age of 7 or 8 or 9, wow, the media sure has the power to change attitudes about race. That's what we were thinking. It was a great time in the 50s and 60s to grow up black in a predominantly black city, all the way up until 1968. With the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King and the memory of John Kennedy, the weight of oppression, lost opportunity, and despair was overwhelming. The people rioted, and part of the city was destroyed. And people would always say, why do black people tear up their own neighborhoods? Well, we would always say that the weight of daily despair demanded it. The bootstraps folks would always say, anybody can be successful in America. Well, we'd say it's hard to pick yourself up by your bootstraps if you never had boots or straps. Afterwards, the city became an island of fear and retribution. We were afraid to go out into Maryland and Virginia at night. We were even afraid to go across Rock Creek Park into Northwest D.C. in the evenings. So the D.C. government instituted 2 desegregating programs focused on schools and housing. My brother and I were part of that school desegregation program, and we got to pick a school in Northwest D.C. We chose the Quaker school, Sidwell Friends School, primarily because of their history as abolitionists. It was an hour-long bus ride across town. We used to take the 80 bus at Fort Totten over to the old Brookland Station on 12th Street, and we'd catch the H2 crosstown bus. But during the riots, the rioters would often throw bottles and bricks at the bus. And we understood why, in a sense. The people on the bus were workers, black folks who worked in white businesses across town, and the domestics who worked in the white homes, and then students like us. And Dr. King had an amazing quote, which was, "A riot is the voice of the unheard." And so intuitively, we understood, even though we felt anxious, we felt guilty that we had opportunity. But oftentimes when we got off that bus, we'd hear the N-word as we walked to school. Later in '68, the D.C. Fair Housing Act was instituted, and a number of families were given an opportunity to buy homes in Northwest D.C. My family was one of them. We got to desegregate our nation's capital. A few weeks later, the police started to visit to comfort us as new arrivals. My brother and I were athletic and had large afros. No laughter. They would visit the house, knock on the door, and they'd march us down to the curb. Underneath the streetlights, an unmarked car would drive by. And then we'd realize that any mugging or purse snatching in our vicinity would lead them back to us. That's probably where we learned about fear and race more than any other lesson. But even after 50 years, when I think about race, I think about the Quakers. The Quaker philosophy was an amazing thing. They had an expectation that everyone would seek the inner light of good in others, or to put it more religiously, to seek the inner light of God in others. Their beliefs were really unique. They believed that everyone could feel salvation inside. They felt that everyone could speak on that experience. They believed in equality, that no person was superior to another. But most importantly, they thought that everyone had God living inside them. So to hurt another person would be to hurt God. Their practices were unique. No pulpit, no sermons, no programs, no passing the plate. Just a group of like-minded people worshiping in quiet. Their firsts were amazing. They were the first to allow women to become elders. They were the first in America to allow women to speak in worship. They were certainly the first in America to allow blacks to worship freely amongst whites. They were persecuted in England. And what I've learned is that people who've suffered oppression, abuse, or persecution develop a sense of empathy. It's that sense of remembering what it feels like to suffer. Have you ever been a part of a Quaker meeting? It's a really neat experience. The elders sit in the middle, the body of people sit around outside, and the elders will look to each other, seek the inner light, and shake hands. And that's how a meeting starts. So the inner light changes people. And the next time you walk down the street and you see someone different than you, think about them with the inner light in mind. Chances are they're not here to harm you, but the inner light takes away the fear. And then when you approach people in this manner, I promise you, the inner light says, the fear of the unknown is the most damaging thing in our nation. And so we have to manage our conflicts with getting to know people. You internet gangsters, stop Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram arguing with each other and talk. Seek the light. Because we're more alike than we are different. We all want the same things. We want decent jobs. We want to earn a good living. We want the Maslows, good food, water, and shelter. We want good education for our children. And we want them to live in a world that's far more freer of race. But we have to admit a few things. One, we all have bias. Two, that bias, we can be conditioned to believe things we don't necessarily want. Three, that bias is a safe harbor for ignorance. And four, ignorance is the incubator for racism. Racism cannot be effective without power. So use whatever power you have for good. But remember this, leadership requires accountability. My dad always used to say this thing, you are responsible for you and the conditions around you. So no matter where you are, in your home, with your family, in your neighborhood, out at the club, or walking through one of our newly gentrified neighborhoods here in DC. The want for righteousness lives inside each of us. We're born with it. You'll find it next to the inner light. Thank you.